So round two of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. Carlsen played d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2. So already a bit of a surprise because Magnus doesn't play the Catalan, at least not in serious classical chess. But Nepo is prepared, so castles, and dc4, standard Catalan variation. And queen c2 going after this pawn immediately. And now usually a6 is played in this position, and it's a move that has been played by Nepo himself against Grishchuk and Anish Giri. But in this game, he surprised Carlsen with b5, which is not a common move, but it has been played by Carlsen himself against Ding Liren. And in that game, Ding Liren went a4, and after b4, knight d2, knight d5, preventing bishop takes a8, takes c5, dc, bishop a6. Carlsen went on to win this game. So obviously Carlsen knows about these positions, but nevertheless it didn't seem that he was prepared for b5. He didn't expect Nepo to go for this line, so he thought here for a bit and decided to play an unknown line, which is not the best line at least according to the engines, but it is still a playable line, and he went for knight to e5. And both players, I assume, were out of book at this point. Bishop takes a8 is the immediate threat in this position, and Nepo went into a think about how to respond to this move, knight e5. First of all, he can play knight d5, block the attack on the rook. He can play c6 like he did in the game, or he can play an interesting line, queen takes d4, again a rare variation. But the point is, if bishop takes a8, then queen takes e5, and black has a knight and two extra pawns for the rook that he just lost. So this is quite an unbalanced and sharp position, and I'm sure Nepo must have thought of this at least, but he chose not to go into this line. So instead he played c6, playing a simple line, because obviously knight takes c6 is not a real move in the position for white, because if takes, then takes, bishop takes. Now he saves his rook, and white may try to create some pressure on this with a4, but then after a6, knight c3, hitting this again, bishop d7, and black has solved all his problems. And in fact, white is struggling to get anything going, and white may soon find himself in a difficult situation in this position. So Carlsen obviously understood that, and he did not take this pawn. Instead, he went for a4. He's trying to undermine this pawn structure here, because once b5 falls, then c6 is going to fall, and then c4 is going to fall as well. So that's going to be a problem for black to deal with immediately. So Nepo plays knight d5. Note that in this position, queen takes d4 is not on, because knight takes c6. Now he has to take, bishop takes, rook b8, and now a b5 wins a pawn. And white just has an excellent position, because now rook's opened up on this pawn as well. Bishop e3 is coming, and it's simply practically lost for black. So here he had to play knight d5 and stop those ideas. Okay, so knight c3, Carlsen increases the pressure on b5, because now he's threatening a b5, and then knight takes. And there's you can try to think of defending this pawn, but Nepo did the right thing by first kicking this knight out of the position with f6, because now that he's no longer here, c6 feels a little less vulnerable. So he has to go back knight f3, and now Nepo thinks of how he can deal with this situation of a takes b5. One way is to play b4, but then after a move like knight e4 or knight d1, black can probably play bishop a6, and it's still complicated, and it was probably not to Nepo's taste. It can be played, but he probably wanted to keep this square b4 for his own knight to drop into b4 later in the game, as it happened. So Nepo simply played queen d7. Now he's holding this pawn with his queen, so that's defended. So Carlsen plays e4, hits this knight, and Nepo goes to b4, as we mentioned. So hits his queen, so queen to e2, and knight d3. That's the point of moving the knight to b4, because now you get to plant it strongly on d3. And that knight's quite an annoyance to white in this position. Now Carlsen has to make an important decision here, because he cannot afford to waste time. He has to use his lead in development to get something concrete, or black will be able to consolidate, and white will not have anything in the position. So Carlsen correctly went for e5. Now with this move, he's already opened up once more this bishop on this rook. So that's a potential idea in the position if this pawn ever moves, and it will move if you play ab5. It also creates a square for this knight to move into e4. So if he's attacked, he could go to e4 next. So that's another idea. Plus, he's creating ideas of e takes f6 and then knight e4. So lots of things are going on for Carlsen. So let's say bishop, he goes here, pawn to b4. Then he would first play e takes f6. And then after bishop takes f6, he would jump to e4. And now if he takes on d4, then Carlsen is happy to take. And he would probably play rook to b1, hold this pawn. And despite the fact that black is temporarily up 2 pawns here, it is white who is pressing, because these pawns are extremely weak. This knight is really well placed. This bishop is well placed. This bishop's coming out here. If he trades him, well, then rook takes, and all of white's forces are mobilized. And black's forces, on the other hand, are all on the back rank and not playing any active role in this position. So this is dangerous for black. So that's one of the ideas. So Nepo didn't go for b4. He could have played f5, preventing knight e4, and this is a complex line. The engine shows ab5 leads to a lot of interesting complications. For example, if let's say cb5. Now knight e1. Now he's opening up this guy here. So bishop e7 takes, knight takes knight, and now look at this move, knight c6. Temporarily sacrificing a knight, but he's hitting d4. And if white tries to save him, then knight takes d4, queen d1, and knight b3 hits this guy, and rook f to d8, and other such attacking moves are coming in the position. And amazingly, white has compensation, black has compensation for the lost piece. But that's one variation. It should be noted that if white does not save the knight and he plays a move like, let's say, bishop to e3, and then just takes and a6, and black is completely fine. So that's one line. The other line is ab5 and bishop b7, sacrificing this pawn. But if he takes, then knight c6 is incredibly strong, and the pressure on d4 is mounting. Plus, he's got moves like knight b4 as well, and clamping down on white's position even more. So this is not going to be desirable for white. So AB bishop b7, and white would have to find another way of, or maybe just go in for the line that leads to a draw with knight to e1. Okay, but Nepo played bishop e7. Pretty reasonable, nothing special. E takes f6 from Carlsen as he intended. Bishop takes and knight e4. Now he's hitting this guy. And as we have seen before, bishop takes d4 doesn't work because of knight takes, queen takes. And in this case, in fact, even white doesn't have to play rook b1. He can just play bishop e3. And if queen takes b2, then take, and now you can take advantage of this piece on d6 with knight to d6. And in fact, that bishop is lost, because if, let's say, bishop c 8, then a b5, and now this pawn is going to drop next move, and well, of course you cannot allow that. So that's going to be a huge tragedy for black. So this is not an acceptable option. Bishop takes d4. So Nepo played knight a6. He's getting his pieces out of the game, even though it's at the edge of the board, but at least it's not on the back rank anymore, and he can come into b4 and maybe later on come in d5. So he's planning to activate the knight further in the future, but at least for now, it's off the back rank. Carlsen here made a slight inaccuracy, at least according to the engines. He should have played knight takes bishop. And if pawn takes to prevent knight e5, then bishop h6, rook f7, and now knight e1, intending to take this knight out of the game, and plus also queen g4 ideas. And if, let's say, a sample line knight b4 take, white could play b3 and try to undermine this pawn as well, and this would be an incredibly sharp position where white is slightly better. But instead he played knight e5, which allowed Nepo to play an excellent move, bishop takes e5, d5, and then knight c5. So he's forcing Carlsen's hand here, because if he takes, then well, knight c5, and then white's advantage is completely fizzled out. So white has to go for knight d6, which allows knight b3 hitting this rook as well as this bishop, and loses an exchange. But Carlsen obviously saw this and realized that that was his only practical chance of still playing for the initiative in this position. Now the engines think that here white should play bishop e3, but I can see why Carlsen rejected this line, because after knight takes, rook takes, black can simply play knight takes e5, and the position it fizzles out, the advantage fizzles out. White has to play a move like, let's say, bishop c5, and then knight d3 hits him, so take, lots of trades, queen takes here, takes there, threatens f2 now, so he plays rook f7 to hold it, and after all of these complications, the game is pretty level, and white cannot afford to play for a win here because this pawn is just too dangerous, and it's going to be a queen. So white will play for a draw in this position, which is why Carlsen didn't want this pawn here on e5 to be lost. So he did not play bishop e3. Instead, he played rook a to b1, keeping an eye on this pawn with the queen here. So you cannot take this. So Nepo took on c1, and Carlsen was happy to trade here. Now it's important to assess this position. So white has a bishop, black has a bishop, but it's a bad bishop. White has an excellent knight on d6, and that is his main trump in the position, along with the pawn on e5 that guards this knight. If you count the pawns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So black is up a pawn, plus he's up an exchange for the knight. But regardless of that, white still has play in the position, and it's giving him dynamic equality. Maybe not equality, but at least at a human level, it is quite a level position, and black has to pretty much play like an engine to refute white's setup here. So rook to b8. Black's trumps are the rooks, or is the extra rook, so he has to get this rook going. So he's potentially lining this rook down on this file to get it active and cause problems for white. So rook d1, he moves his rook and he eyes this queen. So Nepo moves the bishop away, because he figures that if Carlsen throws in a move like knight takes b5, that is to Nepo's advantage, because once the queen moves away, let's say queen e7, this knight has to move, and then the file is open for Nepo's rook to be active. So he simply drops the bishop back, and invites that sort of a move from Carlsen, but he doesn't do it. Bishop e4 instead. Now he's eyeing kingside activity. And now Nepo played a move which seems quite puzzling. He played c3, which doesn't make much sense initially. Like, why that move? Which is what we are exploring in this Wes Explains Why series. So I'm going to try my best to explain why that move was played c3. So let's imagine, we said before that this rook needs to be active. So what happens if he just takes the pawn on a4 and opens up his rook like that? White here could try if bishop takes h7 check, king takes, queen check, king g8, and now rook d4. And now he's threatening rook h4 and then queen h8 checkmate. Nepo probably saw this far and realized that this is incredibly dangerous, and he has to go for a move like queen e7 here to capture this rook when it gets there. Take and take. And then he can play rook takes b2. And maybe he even saw this far, and after queen takes c4, he was not sure what's going on in the position. But the engines show that rook b1, king g2, c5 check, king h3, bishop d5, and it is black who is pressing. Because let's say if queen takes c5, then a3, he has to take here, then rook takes f2, and if queen takes a7, then rook takes h2, because you can't take here because it's mate on h1. So he pushes him to g4, and now after rook h6, it's clear that white's king is in some trouble here, and there is no immediate perpetual check or anything of that sort for white. So queen takes c5 is not happening. So queen takes a4, but then rook takes f2 anyway, check, and rook comes back, queen g6. Now he's threatening knight e8 with knight f6 or queen g7 as threat. So he comes back, rook b8. And now knight e4 threatening knight f6 again, or knight g5. So takes, and rook c8. And now the rook is behind this passed pawn, and it's threatening to advance. So white has to play queen c4, blockade this pawn. But then white's queen is completely passive. And after a move like rook c6, he protects e6. And white is on the defensive in this position. Maybe he can still hold, but it is definitely black who is pressing here. So this could have been a line that Nepo could have followed, but instead he played c3. So let's explain why. So after c3 and takes, let's say if white tries bc3 and then b takes a4, and then he tries bishop h7. Then after takes, check, king g8, rook d4. The point is this b file is open, so rook b1 check is possible. And then after king g2, c5 is a check to the king, and the rook on d4 is threatened. And white will lose this rook, and he'll no longer have rook h4 in the position. So that was the point, or at least one possible explanation behind c3, to open up this rook to come down to b1. So Carlsen played queen c2, hitting h7, and Nepo played g6. And now Carlsen took here, bc. Now Nepo missed his big chance in this game. He should have played queen g7. Not only does it hold g6, but it also threatens e5. Forces Carlsen to play f4, but then look at this, g5. And now he's starting to undermine white's structure. And once this falls, e5 will fall. And once e5 falls, this knight is loose on d6, and then white's position starts to crumble. So here Carlsen would have had to find a computer-like line with queen b3, take here, knight f5, queen g6, he has to trade, now knight e7. This is a sample engine line. Rook d8, he cannot trade rooks because otherwise black's rooks just gets too active. So rook f1, well, take first, then rook f1, but after take, it is fairly obvious that white is struggling to hold this position. But Nepo missed that chance, and instead he After g6 takes, he took on a4, but that allowed Carlsen to simply take. And now Carlsen is completely fine because this is a weakness, that is a weakness, and he's got enough play for his rook, and that e6 is a weakness as well. So with so many weaknesses and a dominant knight on d6, there's no way Nepo can conjure up some play in this position. So rook d8 was played, and rook a1, now he's hitting a7. So c5 says, okay, you can have a7, but I'll trade off your bishop and then my rooks will come down. He's like, no trading queens here. He takes here, and now a slight finesse from Carlsen with knight takes e4. He could have played queen takes e4, but then black doesn't waste a move and he can play a useful move like rook f8. But if knight takes e4, which is what Carlsen did, he's got to deal with the threat of knight f6 in the position. So Nepo has to waste a move with king h8. And Carlsen's point is that this move, this h8 square, is not the best one for the king, nor is g7. And after knight d6, there's always the threat of knight f7 in some variation. So Carlsen gains a move by taking with the knight instead of with the queen. And now he's also threatening queen takes c5. And surprisingly, there's no good way of defending c5, because if the queen comes down here to defend, then he loses e6. So Nepo played rook b6. He has had enough with this knight, and he's going to swap it off the board with rook takes d6 at any moment now. So queen takes c5. Carlsen says, okay, you can take, but then I'll take. And if you take, then I will take here, and I'll be up pawn on the queen side. So that's probably not what Nepo wants, so he delays that capture. Instead, he plays rook b8, now threatening to play rook b1 check and swap off this rook. So Carlsen plays king g2, and so he doesn't have a check there. So now rook b1, simply rook takes a7. a6, preventing rook takes a7. And now Carlsen plays king h3, getting his king completely out of any line of check on g2. And forcing Nepo to play moves like rook c6, because he cannot really do anything here. Queen d4, king g8. You see the king has to come back to a much better position finally, and he wastes the move. c4, now this pawn is, the queen was tied to the defense of this pawn, but with c4 the knight defends the pawn, so the queen is free to move. Queen c7, Nepo doesn't have many moves in the position. Carlsen doesn't have many moves either, so he goes for queen g4, hits e6, and Nepo finally gets his chance to take on d6. Takes, queen takes, and yes, Carlsen can throw in c5, but Nepo has seen it. Takes with check, king here, rook takes a6 is temporarily up a pawn, but rook f8, and that pawn's not going anywhere. Carlsen played f4 to defend it, but then queen f5 check, trades queens, and now it's a 3-on-2 pawn endgame with rooks, and that's a drawn endgame. And obviously both players understood that at this point, but they played on, I guess for the sake of the audience. Rook a7 check, king g8, king g4, rook b5, rook e7. So he's got the 7th rank, but White's got the 7th rank, but Black is preventing White's king from crossing the 5th rank and getting too active here. So he stays on this rank. So he comes back to kick him out, but now he grabs the 7th rank. So his own king can move forward. There's an interesting draw in this position with h5. Now you may think, wow, that's dangerous because king g5, but yeah, king g7, and thanks to the weakness of this pawn on g3, White cannot make progress. Let's say if rook e3 trying to hold it, then well, rook a5 check, rook e7 just goes back. And let's say he tries f5, then g takes f5. Now you can take either pawn, right? No, you cannot. If you take on h5, that's a terrible blunder because king f6. And now when you move this rook, oops, checkmate. So always be careful of a cornered king in such positions. So he could take maybe like rook takes f5, but then rook a3, hitting this pawn. And he has to come back, but then king g6 and holds the king's pawn. Or if he takes with the king, then same thing, rook a3, king f4, just checks him and keeps an eye on this pawn, and white cannot make any progress. So that was a possibility, but he played king g7, allowing h5, but no problem. He goes king h6, and white cannot make any progress. If let's say king g5, then I guess Nepo would be forced to go into h6, king g4, and then h5, as we have seen before, or a more complicated defense with rook a4. But I'm sure that both players understood that there were many defenses for black here. So h5, king h6, no problem. And now it's just a matter of forcing white to trade this pawn. If he takes, of course, it's drawn, take, 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 and king endgame is easily drawn. So Carlsen goes for g5, trying to keep these two pawns alive so that he could potentially push like this, but Nepo is up to the task. He plays rook g1 check, keeps annoying this king, rook a1, rook h6, rook a4 goes after this, king f3 check. Now if he comes over here, then well, just check. You'll just keep giving checks on the a line. So he goes to that direction, but then rook a4, and the game is drawn, because if let's say king g3, then check here and rook f3, and the pawn will fall unless he tries rook f6, but then h6, and now you have to lose one of the pawns and it's going to be drawn. If rook takes, of course, then take here, and with one pawn you cannot win this endgame. And if king takes h5, then hg, and the game is drawn after king takes, and simply third rank defense with rook a3 and potentially rook a5, rook a6 later. So overall, a really fantastic game, an entertaining game with a lot of complications. Much better than Carlsen versus Caruana with white, because in those games, his games with white were not as interesting, but against Nepo, at least this first game has showed a lot of promise. So I look forward to more entertaining games in this match with Carlsen, both from white and with black.